The laughter started before the cameras even finished rolling. It wasn't nervous or meant to break tension, it was arrogant. A deep mocking sound from a woman who'd spent her life believing she was untouchable. The audience didn't know it yet, but that laugh would become one of the most replayed sounds in courtroom television history. Karen Mitchell, better known now as Fat Karen, leaned back in her chair and smirked as if she were hosting the show, not standing trial on it. The way she looked at Judge Judy, like a parent humoring a clueless child, made it clear she had no idea who she was dealing with. For nearly a decade, Karen had been the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates. As head of the local homeowners association, she ruled with the precision of a petty tyrant and the appetite of someone who craved control more than companionship. Neighbors whispered about her like a school principal who never outgrew detention duty, and she loved it. Every letter she mailed, every fine she imposed, every late-night call to code enforcement made her feel important. She wasn't the type to bake cookies for the block party. She was the type to shut it down because the decorations didn't match HOA color guidelines. Today was supposed to be her victory lap. She had dragged one of her neighbors, a soft-spoken woman named Lillian Cortez, into court for what she called willful property damage. The alleged crime was planting sunflowers not in Karen's yard but in her own. Sunflowers that stood a little too tall, cast too much shade on the street corner, and offended the uniformity Karen guarded like a religion. It was ridiculous, and that's exactly why the producers picked it up for national television. They knew an entitled suburban monarch versus Judge Judy was the kind of oil and fire combination that guaranteed views. When Judge Judy entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed instantly. The murmurs quieted. Even the cameras seemed to steady. She didn't need to speak to command respect. Her silence carried decades of authority. Karen, oblivious to that current, adjusted her cardigan and smiled with performative sweetness. It wasn't respect. It was condescension dressed as charm. She greeted the judge as if introducing herself to a new neighbor, rather than standing before one of the most feared adjudicators in America. "Good morning, Your Honor," Karen said, emphasizing the title with a smirk. "I just hope we can get through this quickly. I have a homeowners meeting to attend after this." Judy's expression didn't change. Her voice stayed calm, with that dangerous undertone familiar to anyone who had seen her legendary takedowns. "We'll take as long as it takes," she replied. "Why don't you tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, why we're all here today?" Karen straightened her papers, every inch the self-styled executive. "This is a simple matter of respect for community rules," she began. "The defendant knowingly violated our landscaping code despite multiple warnings and has refused to pay her fines. It's about accountability, really." The words rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, lines she'd delivered countless times at HOA meetings where her word was law. She expected this to be no different, another chance to show off her leadership. But Judy's gaze didn't blink or waver. She let Karen finish, even nodding slightly as if listening intently, and that, more than anything, gave Karen a false sense of confidence. She mistook patience for approval. The plaintiff, Lillian Cortez, sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, eyes lowered. Exhaustion showed on her face, the kind that comes from years of being targeted by someone who treats rules as weapons. When Judy turned to her and asked softly, "How long has this been going on?" Lillian's voice trembled. "Almost 3 years, Your Honor. I've paid over $8,000 in fines. I tried to comply, but every time I fixed one thing, she found another." The audience shifted. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. Karen's eyes flicked to the camera. A brief realization that she was losing public sympathy, but she covered it with another smirk. "Some people just don't like rules," she said under her breath. Judy heard it. Everyone did. What followed was a masterclass in arrogance. Karen interrupted, argued, and even corrected Judy's interpretation of HOA regulations. The laughter returned, the same ugly, dismissive sound that made the audience collectively recoil. When Judge Judy leaned forward and gave her first quiet warning, "Mrs. Mitchell, you may want to choose your words carefully," Karen chuckled audibly. That laugh sealed her fate. What she didn't know was that Judy had already seen everything she needed to. The evidence, the documents, even the financial discrepancies in Karen's HOA reports. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. It was a loaded gun waiting for the right moment to fire. And Karen, drunk on her own arrogance, had just pulled the trigger herself. If there was one thing Judge Judy had learned after thousands of cases, it was that arrogance always overplays its hand. Karen Mitchell was living proof. The moment Judy issued her quiet warning, the entire courtroom felt the shift. Everyone except Karen. Most people would have straightened up, taken the hint, maybe softened their tone. But Karen, emboldened by her own delusion of superiority, did the opposite. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and let out a small laugh that rippled through the silent room like a crack in glass. "Relax, Your Honor," she said, waving one hand dismissively as if brushing off a fly. "You don't have to threaten me. I know how the law works." The bailiff shifted his weight slightly, a subtle sign he sensed danger. The audience collectively held its breath. Judge Judy didn't react right away. She simply watched Karen the way a storm watches a ship, measuring how much longer it would stay afloat before it broke apart. When she finally spoke, her tone was low, controlled, and unmistakably final. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, every syllable sharp as a gavel strike. "You may want to choose your words more carefully. I don't issue threats. I issue rulings." But Karen wasn't listening, or perhaps couldn't. She was too busy protecting the image she had built for years, the one where she always had the upper hand. To back down on camera would mean admitting weakness. So she did what every entitled person does when cornered by truth. She doubled down. "I'm sure you do," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you can't rule on what you don't understand. HOA law is a little more complicated than small claims, Judge." A collective gasp rolled through the room. Even the cameraman's hands trembled. The air thickened with disbelief. Karen had just implied on national television that Judge Judy, the woman who had practiced law longer than Karen had been alive, didn't understand the law. Judy's expression barely changed, but her eyes darkened. It was the look everyone in the audience knew too well, the one that came right before the storm hit. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judy said again, her voice slower this time, more deliberate. "Are you suggesting that I am not qualified to interpret the law?" Karen's smirk widened. "I'm saying HOA matters are specialized. I've been president for 8 years. Most judges don't even know how these communities operate. No offense, but I've read the entire state property code front to back twice." Judy didn't respond. She didn't need to. That silence, that long surgical pause, was enough to make every person in the room squirm. Karen mistook it for hesitation. She leaned forward, pressing the advantage she thought she had. "You see," she continued, tapping the table for emphasis, "this case isn't about feelings or sympathy. It's about maintaining standards. If people like Mrs. Cortez are allowed to do whatever they want, property values go down. It's my job to protect the community, even if that means making tough calls." There was pride in her voice, the same misplaced pride that had destroyed reputations long before hers. She looked around, expecting nods of agreement. Instead, she met stony silence. The audience's expressions ranged from shock to disgust. Even Lillian Cortez, who had been trembling just minutes earlier, sat perfectly still now, as if watching the slow, inevitable collapse of her tormentor. Judge Judy exhaled softly and leaned back. Her tone stayed calm, but something in it shifted. The temperature dropped. "You believe your actions are justified, then?" "Absolutely," Karen replied without hesitation. "The law backs me up." "Does it?" Judy asked, almost whispering. The question lingered in the air like smoke. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but Judy raised a hand, a small gesture that silenced her instantly. "Before you continue, remember this," Judy said. "This isn't your neighborhood meeting. This is my courtroom, and when I give you the opportunity to speak, you will treat it as a privilege, not a right." The audience responded with a restrained ripple of applause. Karen flushed crimson but forced another laugh, brittle and nervous like glass under too much pressure. She shook her head and muttered just loud enough for the microphones to catch, "Whatever you say, Your Honor. I've dealt with worse threats from my board." Judy leaned forward, her voice low and chilling. "This isn't a threat, Mrs. Mitchell, it's a guarantee. Keep laughing, and you might find out what happens when the law starts looking into your own records." The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared behind her eyes. But it was too late. The cameras were rolling, and her arrogance had already written the script for her downfall. In that instant, everyone in the courtroom knew Judy wasn't bluffing. The trap was set. The countdown had begun. Long before the cameras, the courtroom, and the moment her laughter sealed her fate, Karen Mitchell had been writing the story of her collapse for years. She just didn't know it. Power was her drug, and the Willow Creek Estates HOA was her endless supply. What began as a volunteer role to improve the community evolved into an empire ruled by one woman's insecurities disguised as order. She didn't maintain the neighborhood. She owned it, at least in her mind. And in her world, anyone who resisted deserved punishment. Residents learned quickly that Karen's smile was a warning, not a welcome. The first to feel her wrath was a retired schoolteacher named Denise Hall. Her offense was hanging a bird feeder without prior approval. Within a week, Karen mailed 3 violation notices, followed by a $250 fine and a personal visit to lecture Denise about attracting pests. When Denise tried to reason with her, Karen's tone turned icy. "Rules are rules," she said, tilting her head just enough to feign mercy. Denise removed the feeder that same day, but not before word spread through the neighborhood. Karen watched everything. Each year, her power grew. She rewrote bylaws, replaced board members who disagreed, and instituted a policy requiring written permission for holiday decorations. She claimed it preserved visual harmony. In truth, it was about control. She fined one family $400 for leaving a pumpkin out past November rent. Another was billed for unsightly laundry visibility when a towel was left drying on a backyard fence. To Karen, these weren't absurdities. They were victories, each new rule proof of her dominion. Behind that power was fear. She couldn't stand being ignored. She thrived on submission. When people pushed back, her response was always the same: louder, harsher, more personal. She didn't just fine people, she embarrassed them, posting letters on community bulletin boards with red ink circles around names and offenses. "We hold standards here," she would proclaim at meetings, her voice echoing while neighbors sat in awkward silence. Then came the Cortez family. Lillian and her husband, Daniel, had moved to Willow Creek 3 years earlier, drawn by its manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. They were good people, quiet, hardworking, proud of their little yellow house on the corner. Their 2 children, Sophia and Mateo, loved drawing chalk flowers on the driveway. It was innocent, joyful, the kind of thing that makes a house a home. But Karen saw color where she wanted conformity. Within days, the Cortez family received their first violation letter: unauthorized pavement markings. The fine was $50, then $100, then $500. Lillian tried to reason with her. She visited Karen's office, a converted spare bedroom filled with binders labeled compliance and infractions. She brought cookies as a peace offering, but the meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. "If you wanted to live somewhere without standards," Karen told her, "you should have bought a house in a cheaper neighborhood." From that moment on, the Cortez family became her favorite target. She measured their grass, timed their Christmas lights, even photographed their mailbox to prove paint fading. Over 2 years, she issued more than 20 citations, totaling nearly $8,000 in fines. The money was devastating, but the humiliation was worse. Lillian's kids stopped drawing outside. Daniel stopped attending neighborhood gatherings. People avoided eye contact when the Cortez family passed by, not out of judgment but fear. No one wanted to be next. Karen mistook their silence for victory. She believed she'd won, not realizing that every fine, every cruel letter, every smug smile was quietly building a record, and someone had been watching. Judge Judy's research team had spent the night before the trial combing through Karen's history. They found patterns: suspicious spending from HOA funds, overlapping addresses between community accounts and Karen's personal banking. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to know something was wrong. When Judy read the summary report that morning, she reportedly muttered a single line to her producer: "She's not a neighborly woman. She's a bully with a balance sheet." In the courtroom, while Karen smugly defended her right to enforce rules, Judy was already connecting dots. The arrogance on display wasn't new. It was a symptom of years spent unchecked. Karen's sense of power had insulated her from consequence. That insulation was about to burn. As Judy reviewed the files in front of her, she saw it all. The arrogance, the cruelty, the meticulous way Karen documented every punishment, but never her own actions. It was all there, neatly typed and color-coded like a confession disguised as professionalism. And in that moment, Judy decided she wouldn't just rule on the case. She would make an example. So when Karen laughed again in that courtroom, it wasn't the sound of victory. It was the echo of every cruel laugh she'd ever unleashed on her victims. And soon those echoes were going to come back for her, louder than she could imagine. By the time Chapter 4 of Karen Mitchell's life began, the courtroom had transformed into something different. Not just a stage for small claims, but a theater of reckoning. The smugness that once coated her every word was beginning to crack, though she didn't know it yet. She still thought the camera belonged to her, that the world was watching a woman confidently defending community standards. What she didn't see was how fast the tide had turned. Every viewer, every face in that audience had already chosen sides. Judy wasn't the villain here. She was the storm Karen had been daring to strike for years. Judge Judy leaned forward, not with anger but with precision. Her tone softened, which somehow made the air heavier. "Mrs. Mitchell," she began, "you've been quite vocal about accountability and responsibility. I admire that. So let's talk about it, shall we?" Karen smiled, mistaking civility for surrender. "Of course," she said. "Finally, we're on the same page." "Excellent," Judy replied. "Then I'm sure you won't mind helping me understand how your HOA handles its financial reporting." Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "Your financial reporting," Judy repeated, sliding a folder across the bench. "You've referenced community standards and bylaws several times today. I assume you're equally committed to transparency." Karen hesitated, her painted smile faltering for the first time. I don't see how that's relevant, Your Honor." Judy didn't move. Her voice was calm, cold and steady, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be terrifying. "It's relevant because you're asking this court to believe you act in your community's best interest. That belief depends on your integrity, Mrs. Mitchell. So, humor me." Karen's throat tightened. She forced a laugh, trying to reassert control. "With all due respect, Judge, I'm not on trial here. This is about the defendant's violation, not me." "Every courtroom reveals more than what's written on the case file," Judy said. "You'd be amazed how often the person pointing the finger has something to hide." The audience murmured, the words echoing like a verdict. Karen felt every eye turn toward her. For the first time, the spotlight felt hostile. She reached for her papers, flipping them as if the right page could rescue her. "If this is some attempt to intimidate me—" "Intimidate you?" Judy interrupted, letting steel slip into her tone. "Mrs. Mitchell, intimidation implies I see you as a threat." "I don't. I see you as a lesson." The line landed like a gavel. Even the bailiff's lips tightened into the faintest smile. Judy gestured toward the folder again. "Inside, you'll find your HOA's 2022 financial statements. They're public records, or at least they should have been." Karen's pulse quickened. Her fingers twitched, but she didn't touch the folder. She tried to laugh again, but it died halfway out of her throat. "I don't handle those personally," she stammered. "The treasurer does." "Oh, of course," Judy said smoothly. "That would be your cousin, correct? The one living in Arizona." Karen froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The audience gasped again. "You listed her as treasurer," Judy continued evenly, "yet the contact information leads back to your home address and email." Interesting oversight. Color drained from Karen's face. I can explain that," she said, but Judy raised a hand. "No need. I've seen this story before. Power without oversight. Rules for everyone except the one enforcing them. Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, when did you decide you were above the law you claim to protect?" "I'm not above—" "Yes, you are," Judy cut in. "You just don't know it yet." The silence that followed was suffocating. You could almost hear the hum of the cameras capturing every detail. The tightening of Karen's jaw, the trembling of her fingers, the widening eyes of the audience. "I'm giving you an opportunity, Mrs. Mitchell," Judy said, voice measured and deliberate. "Right now, to stop digging the hole you're in. Because if you keep talking, we're going to have to open another file. One that doesn't end with a fine, but with a forfeit." Karen's voice cracked. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Judy said, eyes sharp as glass. "I'm warning you. There's a difference. A threat is based on emotion. A warning is based on evidence. And in this case, the evidence is starting to pile up faster than your arrogance can bury it." The gallery fell utterly silent. Karen didn't realize it, but Judy had just given her the rope she would soon hang herself with. The only question was whether she'd recognize it, or keep pulling until the trap snapped shut. As Judy called for a short recess, The cameras cut to Karen's face and still defiant, still clinging to a confidence already slipping through her fingers. Behind the fading smirk, a flicker of panic began to bloom. The woman who once ruled her neighborhood like a queen had no idea she was standing in her own castle's ruins. When court resumed, the tension was no longer hidden. It was heavy enough to taste. The air buzzed with that peculiar silence that settles just before a reckoning. Karen Mitchell walked back into the courtroom with a stiffness in her gait, chin still high, but the confident rhythm of her steps was gone. She'd spent the recess whispering furiously to her assistant off camera, trying to regain control of a situation she didn't yet understand. Judge Judy sat calm and immovable, eyes on the folder before her like a hunter waiting for prey to step into view. When the cameras came back on, Judy didn't waste a second. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, voice measured but sharp. "During our break, I had my clerk review the HOA's most recent filings. I'd like to read something aloud." Karen stiffened, eyes narrowing. "Your Honor, I fail to see why my association's paperwork is being dragged into—" "Sit down," Judy said, her tone cutting like glass. Karen froze mid-sentence, then lowered herself into the chair. Soft, nervous laughter rippled through the gallery. Judy continued, flipping through the folder with deliberate slowness. "It says here you've been the acting HOA president for 8 consecutive years. That's impressive. Must take a lot of trust from your neighbors." Karen tried to smile. "Yes, Your Honor, it does. I've always worked hard to—" "And yet," Judy interrupted, "there's a curious pattern." She adjusted her glasses and read from the document. "Annual landscaping budget, $124,400. She turned the page. "Vendor Greenleaf Maintenance Services. Payment routing to an account ending in 4712. She looked directly at Karen. "Would you like to explain why that account also belongs to your personal checking?" The audience gasped. Even the bailiff's eyebrows lifted. Karen's hands twitched on the table. That's a mistake," she stammered. "There must be some mix-up." "A mix-up that's occurred 4 years in a row," Judy said evenly, "because according to these statements, your association has paid over $50,000 to that same account under the label Community Improvements." She leaned forward slightly. "What kind of improvements were you making, Mrs. Mitchell? New playgrounds? Better lighting? Or perhaps a few personal luxuries?" Karen swallowed hard. "You're twisting things. That's not what—" "I'm reading your own financial records," Judy cut in. "If they're twisted, you're the one who wrote them that way." Murmurs rose through the courtroom. Cameras tightened on Karen's face, jaw clenched, eyes darting for a lifeline that wasn't there. Judy didn't let up. "Tell me something," she said. "Do your neighbors know about this? The same people you fined for unauthorized decorations and grass height violations, do they know you've been routing their money into your personal account?" "That's not true," Karen said, her voice cracking. "I've dedicated my life to that community. I've worked—" "Save it," Judy snapped. "Your community didn't ask you to play dictator with their wallets. You used authority as a shield for greed, and now that shield is full of holes." Karen's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth again, but Judy raised a hand. "Don't. Every time you speak, you remind us this isn't about law, it's about ego. And if there's one thing I can't stand more than dishonesty, it's arrogance wrapped in self-righteousness." Light applause broke from the audience before the bailiff silenced it with a glare. Judy waited for quiet, then continued, her voice lower but somehow even more dangerous. "I've seen people like you, Mrs. Mitchell. You think that because you run a small neighborhood you understand justice. But justice isn't a rule book. It's a mirror, and today it's finally facing you." Karen's breathing quickened. Her hand trembled as she shuffled her papers, desperate to project control. But Judy wasn't finished. She flipped one more page. "And here's the most interesting part," she said. "A transfer of $8,900 labeled maintenance reimbursement was sent to your name, one day after you issued a fine to Mrs. Cortez for the same amount. Coincidence?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I don't remember that." "Oh, I bet you don't," Judy said. "But the receipts do." The courtroom went completely silent. Judy leaned back, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Cortez," she said, turning to the defendant, "how long did you say you've lived under this woman's rule?" 3 years, Your Honor," Lillian said softly. "And in those 3 years, how much have you paid in fines?" "Almost 9,000. Judy nodded slowly, then turned back to Karen. "Isn't that fascinating?" she said, "the exact amount down to the dollar. You took this woman's peace, her savings, and her dignity, and turned it into a payday. Karen tried to speak, but her voice broke. Don't lie to me, Judy snapped. You lied to them long enough. You stole from the people who trusted you, and you laughed while doing it. The difference between you and me, Mrs. Mitchell, is that I don't need to raise my voice to end your story. The truth does that for me. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen sat frozen, eyes glassy, as if she had just realized the walls were closing in. Judy tapped the folder once sharply, punctuating the moment. We'll be discussing restitution next, she said. But for now, consider this your wake-up call. The audience didn't cheer this time. They watched, some in awe, others in quiet satisfaction, as the Queen of Willow Creek finally met a judge she couldn't overrule. And for the first time in her life, Karen Mitchell had no rules left to hide behind. The moment Judy finished speaking, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Every camera stayed trained on Karen's face, waiting for the reaction that would define her. Her lips trembled as she searched for words, but none came. The arrogance that had been her armor for years cracked in real time, piece by piece, as humiliation and fear settled in. Her shoulders sagged, her breathing turned shallow. She looked around the courtroom, not for help but for belief. She searched the room for anyone, even one person, who might still think she was right. No one did. The people who once nodded along at her HOA meetings were gone. In their place sat a silent audience, eyes fixed on her downfall. For years, Karen had wielded silence as a weapon, letting others talk themselves into fear, filling the room with apologies while she stood with folded arms, feigning calm. Now that same silence was her punishment, swallowing her, suffocating her in the space between guilt and pride. Finally, she snapped. You think you know me? She shouted, voice shaking, eyes wet. You think this paper means anything? I've worked for that community. I've spent years keeping that place from falling apart while everyone else complained. Judy didn't flinch. Hands resting lightly on the bench, she held Karen in that calm, clinical gaze that made her verdicts feel inevitable. Mrs. Mitchell, she said evenly, this isn't about effort. It's about ethics. And from where I'm sitting, yours have long since been evicted. The courtroom gasped. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her defiance faltered. She looked down at her trembling hands, then at the folder, the same folder that had undone her. Slowly, she shook her head, whispering almost to herself, You don't understand. They all hated me. They wanted me to fail. They set me up. Judy's voice softened slightly, but the words still cut. The only person who set you up, Mrs. Mitchell, is the one in your reflection. Whatever composure Karen had left shattered. Her shoulders sagged as tears filled her eyes. This isn't fair, she muttered, half to Judy, half to herself. I kept order. I kept things perfect. Perfect for whom? Judy asked quietly. You call it order. The people who lived under you call it oppression. She leaned in just a fraction. You spent years punishing good people for living their lives. And the irony is that you were the one breaking the law the entire time. This includes vehicles, savings accounts, and any real estate registered in your name. Karen's head snapped up, eyes wide. My house? Yes, Judy said without hesitation. The property at 214 Willow Creek Lane will be forfeited and sold to repay damages owed to the community fund and affected residents. You abused your position, Mrs. Mitchell. Now that position is gone. The words hit like a physical blow. She swayed, and the bailiff stepped forward, steadying her as her breathing quickened. You can't do this, she whispered. That's my home. I built it. Judy looked over her glasses. No, Mrs. Mitchell. You built it with other people's money and their misery. You don't own that house, you rented it from your victims. The silence that followed was the kind that lives in memory. Karen's face went pale. She stared at the floor, blinking through tears. In the back of the courtroom, Lillian Cortez sat with hands clasped, watching justice finally arrive. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled as if years of tension had lifted. Judy continued, her tone softer but not merciful. I could impose fines, even probation. But none of that will teach you what you refuse to learn. Losing your home isn't punishment, Mrs. Mitchell. It's perspective. For once, you'll know what it feels like to live without power. Karen let out a strangled sob. Please, she said. Don't take everything. I was trying to make it right. I made mistakes, but Judy raised a hand. Everyone makes mistakes. Arrogance turns mistakes into crimes. And you, Mrs. Mitchell, made a career out of them. The gavel came down once, sharp, final, unflinching. This court orders immediate forfeiture of the property. Case closed. The sound echoed like a closing door. Karen stayed frozen, staring ahead as if her body refused what her mind already knew. Slowly she stood. The bailiff guided her out quietly as the cameras followed. She didn't look at the audience or at Judy. Her steps were heavy, the steps of a woman walking out of her own life. Outside, reporters swarmed. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any comments? Do you regret your actions? What will you do now?" She didn't answer. She kept walking past the flashing lights and the noise. Every word of her downfall had already been written. Every headline, every replay, every judgment. At the courthouse steps, she stopped and looked up at the sky. The cameras caught her swollen eyes and trembling lips as she whispered something no one could hear. Some said it was "I'm sorry," others said "it's over." The words didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. That evening, the neighborhood she once ruled met for the first time without her. The new HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve her policies, refund wrongfully charged fees, and dedicate a bench in the community garden to the people she'd mistreated. Not in her honor, but as a reminder. A plaque beneath it read, "Power means nothing if it costs your humanity." And somewhere across town, in a small rented apartment she never imagined she'd call home, Karen Mitchell sat alone, staring at an eviction notice and the echo of her own laughter. The same laugh that once filled a courtroom now haunted her like a ghost she could never silence. The story of Karen Mitchell didn't end with a gavel strike. It began there. Within hours of Judge Judy's ruling, the clip went viral across every platform. News anchors dissected it, commentators replayed it, and millions watched one woman's arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. The hashtags $Judge Judy Justice and $Warho Karen trended for days. People who had never heard of Willow Creek Estates now knew every detail of its fallen ruler. Beneath the noise, something deeper stirred, a collective satisfaction that real justice still meant something. Back in Willow Creek, life began to breathe again. For the first time in years, neighbors greeted one another without fear of violation letters or hidden cameras. The fences that had divided them started to come down, literally and figuratively. Lillian Cortez planted new sunflowers in her front yard, their golden heads swaying in the morning light. Children returned to the sidewalks, drawing chalk flowers where warnings had once been posted. There was laughter again, free, human, never cruel. Board meetings that once felt like interrogations became gatherings. People shared stories, food, and plans for improvements that didn't come with threats or fines. At the center of the small park, beneath an old oak, a new bench appeared with a brass plaque. "Power means nothing if it costs your humanity." It wasn't a message for residents. It was a warning to anyone tempted to follow in her footsteps. Meanwhile, far from Willow Creek, Karen Mitchell's life grew painfully quiet. The woman who once filled rooms with her voice now lived in near silence. The eviction was swift. Her house was listed and sold within weeks, proceeds divided to repay the community fund. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, thin walls, borrowed furniture. That first night, the echo of her mocking laugh bounced in her mind like a memory she couldn't shut off. Days passed, weeks, reporters stopped calling. The world moved on to newer scandals. But the internet never forgets. Each time she opened her phone, her face stared back, frozen mid-laugh in 1,000 memes. Her downfall replayed in countless compilations titled, "The Moment She Realized." The sound of her own laughter became her punishment. One morning, she drove past her old neighborhood. The streets were alive again. Children played where she once enforced silence. Lillian tended her sunflowers. Karen slowed but didn't stop. Their eyes met for a moment. Lillian didn't glare or smirk. She simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that the past was over. Karen nodded back, tightened her grip on the wheel, and drove on. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at unopened mail. For the first time in her life, there were no forms to sign, no meetings to schedule, no rules to enforce. Just silence and the faint flicker of remorse. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "Maybe it's time I start over." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first honest thing she'd said in years. Judge Judy never commented publicly on the case. Weeks later, when asked about the viral clip, she only smiled. Sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. That line became the quote everyone remembered, carved into the final frame of every re-upload, printed on shirts, turned into captions, because it reminded the world that truth still had a voice, even in an age when arrogance often grabs the microphone. That's what made this more than entertainment. It was a reminder that entitlement, no matter how powerful it feels, eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies. That silence, earned through humility, can speak louder than laughter born of cruelty. So if you've ever been on the wrong end of someone like Karen, someone who used power as a weapon, remember this story. Sometimes the loudest justice isn't the one that roars in anger, but the one that whispers in truth. If this story made you believe again in justice that actually means something, hit the like button. Drop a comment with the word truth, and don't forget to subscribe. Because arrogance can make noise, but integrity always makes history.